Hey folks, lots of new cards today, and apologize for this one being a little late. I've been waiting on the mysterious disguised toast card reveal. He turned it down. I thought maybe they'd move it to somebody else. It's still on the schedule, but it's not getting revealed, so I guess we're gonna proceed. If you're seeing this, this means that card has not made it into this video, which is unfortunate. We lost a little time, but all in all, we still got a lot of exciting cards to talk about.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Up first here we have the Pharaoh Cat, a 1-mana 1/2 beast for Rogue, with Battlecry, add a random reborn minion to your hand. So a really interesting little early game option here for Rogue. This 1-mana 1/2 stat line is serviceable. It's not quite a 1/3, but nonetheless, we've seen some cards like Town Crier with this stat line be pretty successful, so that's a good start. Also, we've just got a value/resource generator here, thanks to this Battle Cry. Reborn minions are pretty much across the gamut when it comes to quality and size, so you're not going to be able to predict very well what this is going to turn into. It might be a nice 2-drop to follow it up on curve, and it might be a giant 10-drop that's going to be really hard to play for a long time. But because you're happy to play the 1/2 anyway, getting a bad reborn roll off of this is a risk that you're going to be okay to take, just because getting a minion out there to start chipping away at your opponent's board, particularly in combination with your turn 2 weapon, will probably feel like a good thing no matter what. And then occasionally when you high roll, that's some nice upside. Beyond that, reborn minions are sometimes class cards. Right now, I think almost half of reborn cards revealed have been class cards, so you have a chance to use this in things like Burgle Rogue as well. So there are even some synergies for a card like this to explore. So what we're looking at is just, I think, a great opening game move here for Rogues. That'll be a powerful resource for them. Getting that turn 1 start is good for tempo decks. It's going to be relevant for Burgle decks. Just feels like a cheap combo enabler for Rogue. So this card's doing a lot of things really, really well. And what that means is, I think it's definitely going to see some play. Mortuary Machine, a new 5-mana 8/8 mech. And it reads, after your opponent plays a minion, give it reborn. So we've got a big, scary 5-mana threat. I was just talking about these in a previous video, my last custom cards video, in the vein of Bittertide Hydra and Fel Reaver from back in the day. This one's even a mech like Fel Reaver, so you get this giant body, but you've got a downside. And in this case, it's a downside where your opponent's stuff gets better. And I'm going to be honest, I think this card's pretty cool. I've seen some mixed takes on the Mortuary Machine, but I know that these cards have succeeded in the past. These big 5-mana 8/8s are great for aggro decks that are looking to just, like, overwhelm their opponent with big, scary stuff and hit them in the face for 8. And this is a mech, which I think gives it even more applications. We've seen some pretty aggressive and big, scary mech stuff. Mech Hunter, Mech Paladin, for instance, might use this card nicely. And I'm not sure this downside is all that detrimental. There's one scenario where I think this downside's really, really scary, and that's Ziliax. And unfortunately, Ziliax is a 5-mana card, so Ziliax alone might keep Mortuary Machine out of play for now. But if Ziliax, or when Ziliax rotates out of standard format, Mortuary Machine will still be lingering around. So I do think there's a pocket or a time when Mortuary Machine could get good if there's not that, like, perfect 5-mana answer. And the reason Ziliax is so good, right, is because giving your opponent a Divine Shielded minion with lifesteal is pretty nuts. And of course, giving it Reborn means it's going to come back and they can attack with it immediately. And they're maybe going to get like 6 more health out of their Ziliax, right? And that's not what you're looking to do with your Mortuary Machine. But in most other cases, giving your opponent an extra 1 health isn't going to be all that detrimental. You can either just kind of ignore that minion, or you can just, like, ping it off, or, you know, whatever, trade in a small minion into it. So the extra reborn aspect isn't going to hurt you all that much outside, I think, of Ziliax. So, yes, I think this card has potential anyway, because your opponent won't always have a Ziliax on turn 5, and sometimes you'll just get there on the back of a card like Mortuary Machine. And then there's still that world post-Ziliax where this might succeed. Now, of course, there won't be as much mech support post-Ziliax, so the aspect of it being a mech may not be as relevant at that point, but it'll still be a big 8/8, so I think it'll have potential. Now, I'll admit this is still not as good as things like Conjurer's Cage, Conjurer's Calling Mage, Mountain Giants on turn 4, like those, or turn 3 even. Those are better plays in a lot of cases, but this is similar in some ways. and presents just as much of a threat for decks that can't do that sort of thing. In other words, fair decks. So absolutely, I see a path forward for Mortuary Machine. If not right away, still someday this looks like a card that could be played. Speaking of conjuring, we've got the Conjured Mirage, a 4-mana 3/10 with Taunt in the neutral set. At the start of your turn, shuffle this minion into your deck. So, an intriguing card in a couple ways here, and an interesting one. So, the idea is you play this down. It's a really big taunt that your opponent maybe can't deal with just because it has so much health. And if they can't kill it, then it's going to go away. So, you'll lose that body on board, but you'll get it back in your deck. So, you can play it at a future date and maybe just continue dropping these over the course of a game, and your opponent's just like, ugh, and you really deny their ability to get any face damage through. That's a pretty neat application, because if they only have like 6 or 7 damage, well, shoot, I can't deal with a Mirage right now. I'm just going to sit here and chill and wait till the future turn, and that just sort of buys you time. It buys you more draws to find your next Conjured Mirage, so on and so forth. So there is just this stall opportunity where you drop this wall in front of your opponent and there's nothing they can do. It kind of almost reminds me of Doomsayer in a way. You're just trying to buy yourself some time. Very different than Doomsayer in its execution of that aspect, but similar end result. Now, beyond that, this card also has some interesting applications for Priest, where it's just a big body they can happily silence. And 10 health is ridiculous for a 4-mana minion. So if a Priest can silence this right away, and they need to do it right away, right? Because otherwise it's going to go back into their deck. Then they have this body to build on for future turns where they can just, double its health a couple times, and suddenly they've got lethal. So Conjured Mirage looks like it has a couple ways to be played successfully. I don't even think it needs Silence Priest necessarily. It's going to see, we're just going to have to figure out how awkward it feels to play this. If your opponent does go to the trouble of killing it for you, by the way, though, then you've gotten your value anyway, because you've got a way overstated minion for its cost. So absolutely, Conjured Mirage, I think, looks intriguing. Whether your opponent kills it or they don't, it's still kind of doing its job, which is just stalling. Even though it may not get rid of the stats on board for Priest, just buying time into Mass Hysteria on turn 5 might be all that the Priest needs in the first place. So, cool card in a couple different directions. I'm surprised I like this one, to be honest, but I think it's going to be played. So moving on here to Shadow of Death, a new 4-mana rogue spell. I don't think she should open that coffin. That looks very scary. It reads, choose a minion, shuffle 3 shadows into your deck that summon a copy when drawn. So we've got here a gang up / Togwaggle scheme sort of card. Even a little bit like Pharaohs Strider as well at that 4-mana spot. And we've seen some historical precedents that these kinds of cards can work. Shadow of Death is particularly interesting compared to something like Togwaggle Scheme because the minions are immediately summoned when drawn, which means you're not spending mana on them. So it's not a fatigue prevention card like Togwaggle Scheme so much as a tempo card like Pharaohs Strider, where you're getting some stuff into play. And with cards like Myra's Unstable Element, we know that drawing through your deck and getting these things summoned is absolutely a viable option. I used to do that all the time with Pharaohs Strider. So Shadow of Death has some interesting lines of play, and in particular, you can choose any minion, not just your own, so you can take your opponent's big crazy threat and shuffle 3 of those into your deck and potentially summon some 8/8 Mountain Giants, right, for free on future turns, and that's pretty cool. The downside to a card like this, of course, is that you're taking a huge tempo sacrifice when you play it. So unlike Pharaohs Strider, which got you a 4/4 and felt okay for 4 mana, this isn't doing anything for 4 mana. You're just kind of taking a pass. So will you be able to afford to do that in a deck that likes this result? I don't know. It's going to be hard. Rogue already has troubles when they sacrifice tempo. Preparation could help a little, but you're still spending a couple cards and still spending 2 mana to do nothing at the moment. So this is even swingier than things like Pharaohs Strider. I do think there are still, applications for this to do sneaky, crazy things. It's a possibility. It's going to be something you randomly generate sometimes and you're excited about. But at the end of the day, this might just be a little bit too slow for a class that's so reliant on tempo. And I don't know if shenanigans are enough to get this card there alone. So I think it's got opportunities, but it's going to be a little bit of a challenge for Shadow of Death to become a staple rogue card. Moving on to the Bone Wraith, a new 4-mana 2/5 neutral taunt with Reborn. This would be a great card to get off of your Pharaoh Cat, by the way. And what we've got here is a defensive mid-game tool. 5 health for 4 mana is solid. 2 attack, a little less impactful, but we have Reborn. So what this means is we've got a 2-piece taunt here that will come back to life as a 2/1 and potentially disrupt your opponent a little more. So it's all about disruption and kind of a speed bump with a card like this. The question is, will it be good enough to make the cut in non-Reborn decks? Probably not in my mind. Like, I can compare this to other options. You know, it almost feels a bit like a Sludge Belcher, for instance. That was a 3/5 taunt that summoned a 1/2. This is a cheaper card, but I think the 1 health on the Reborn aspect here is pretty detrimental to a card like this. It makes it far easier to just ping that off. It's much less disruptive than something like a Sludge Belcher, plus I think the 2 attack is meaningfully weaker. Even with a card like Tar Creeper, we saw as the kind of ultimate early to mid-game taunt, the 3 attack on Tar Creeper was really important when you were playing it defensively. Your opponent had to trade stuff in. Often you'd kill those 3/3s. I think this leaves a lot of stuff on board and doesn't take nearly as many favorable trades. That's why it feels more like a speed bump than like a wall, right? So I think this will create more awkwardness than real problems for your opponent. Even when I compare it to things like Serenite Chain Gang, that was advantageous in a couple different ways. More total health on the taunts, same attack, and then you got the bodies immediately, whereas this one is delayed. So I don't think this shifts as well into like mid-range decks like Serenite Chain Gang could do, nor do I think it's just as good of a defensive option as Serenite Chain Gang either. It can't counter pressure nearly as well. So a handful of different attributes about this card make it seem like it's worse than some comparables we've seen in Hearthstone, and that doesn't make it a bad card necessarily. Like, it's going to be totally fine when you generate it. I just don't think it's going to be good enough to make the cut in most constructed decks. I'm sure there will be better options, unless perhaps you're running a Reborn specific deck and you just need enough Reborn cards, like a Quest Paladin, for instance. Might just have to toss this in because they're desperate for decent Reborn plays. It is certainly fine in that sort of environment. It's just not a card you're going to go out of your way for. Moving on here, we have Embalming Ritual for Priest, a new 1-mana spell that gives a minion Reborn. And your first thought might be, oh no, more Resurrect synergy stuff, which may be relevant to this card. But I think outside of, you know, like the traditional Res Priest builds out there, I think this is actually made for maybe cheaper Death Rattles and even a tempo style of play. In other words, I don't know if playing, you know, an Embalming Ritual on Yasharaj in Wild is going to be worth it just to get a 1 health big crazy late game threat, but bringing back to life a cheap tempo minion, another cheap option of a death rattle card in the early game, could be pretty impactful. So I do think there are ways to squeeze this into your early game turns and to make big plays out of it where you're just trying to keep a stickier, more relevant board for future buffs. Those sorts of things do seem like relevant options for Embalming Ritual. So I don't know if that style of Priest will be relevant immediately, but when I look at a card like this, I do see potential for it to just squeeze its way into decks and into turns, so absolutely it looks like a playable option to me. Moving on to the Tomb Warden, a new warrior card, an 8-mana 3/6 mech with Taunt, Battlecry, summon a copy of this minion. So we've got an old school Serenite Chain Gang, but it's big, 8-mana 3/6. It doesn't seem like a lot of extra stats here for such the double the mana cost, but there is some scary opportunity for a card like this. Obviously, we've seen some hand buff Taunt synergy cards offered so far in this expansion, so theoretically, you know, this is not really a 3/6. Maybe it's like a 5/8 or a 7/10, and you're summoning multiple copies of it, and that becomes pretty crazy. A lot of stats in play, and they're getting Taunt for only 8 mana, particularly in a mech deck where those stats have Rush. That's pretty nuts. We've already seen Amani Warbear as like a successful-ish card early in its lifespan, and these could be like multiple Amani Warbears for 8 mana, right? Where they're taking trades and being scary. Not only that, but they're mechs too, so they have all kinds of mech synergies beyond the Rush aspect from Dr. Boom. You've got magnetic plays as well, and, you know, survival against your own dynamatics and all those sorts of things. So Really, really powerful looking option once they get on board. The challenge for a card like this is that it is 8 mana, so it comes a little bit later in the game. It's a little slow. I don't really know if a mech warrior would need to run this, so it's definitely going to have to be limited to a taunt warrior build at the moment, which would certainly still have something like Dr. Boom Mad Genius, so you still get to explore some of those mech synergies. But in that case, I can see this being an incredibly defensive wall sort of play. It reminds me of like the Twin Emperors from Whispers of the Old God. You're pretty happy to just get a couple 4/6s on board, and I think Tomb Warden will feel the same way. Some decks just won't have answers to this. They'll just be totally stomped out, and especially because it's splitting your taunt across 2 different bodies, which means if they have a silence or removal card for one, then suddenly they still have to deal with the other. And what that means is some people just won't have answers, and a card like this will feel really, really rewarding to play. So, yep, it's a mech, it's a taunt, it's fitting the 2 primary archetypes we see for Warrior moving forward, so absolutely it looks like a solid card to me. Moving on to Pharaoh's Blessing, a new 6 mana spell for Paladin. Give a minion +4/+4, Divine Shield, and Taunt. So we have here a older brother to Blessing of Kings, a couple extra mana points, but you get Divine Shield and Taunt. So theoretically some extra applications here, either creating like a super defensive minion or perhaps setting up something like a value trade via the Divine Shield. Immortal Prelate comes to mind as a synergy card pretty immediately as well, where you can give your Immortal Prelate Taunt successfully in this current meta, which is nice because that means you can create a nice defensive thing that you keep drawing so that when you play your big crazy Immortal Prelates in the late game, they aren't just stuck there and your opponent ignores them. Instead, your opponent is forced to actually interact with them. So I do see some intriguing applications for this card. Unfortunately, I don't think it's really worth the extra mana here over Blessing of Kings to get Divine Shield and Taunt. Decks that like to run those aggressively minded buffs are typically just kind of going face and creating pressure scenarios that their opponents can't answer, and I particularly don't think the taunt really helps there. Divine Shield can help, but in most cases I think you'd rather have the flexibility of additional mana to play other cards. So Blessing of Kings is going to be better in a majority of environments, or if we compare this to something like magnetic buffs like War Gear or Missile Launcher that we've also seen be successful in Paladin, and of course other classes as well. This also just looks a little weaker to me than cards like Missile Launcher or cards like War Gear, which give you the same sorts of big stat bumps, but have the flexibility of also being minions when needed. So both for Paladin specifically in that case, and just compared to the buffs we've seen that are successful in the past, I don't really see it for Pharaoh's Blessing. Now, some people are comparing this to Spike Ridge Steed as well, because it's a 6 mana buff that gives something taunt. But if you make that comparison, it still looks worse, because Spike Ridge Steed gives you the same total stats of 8, but you also get this 2/6 minion, which I think is worth more than a Divine Shield in this case. Theoretically, the Divine Shield also gives you 8 total stats if you can take a trade, but in some cases Divine Shield doesn't. It just gets pinged off, and your 2/6 does not get pinged off from a Spike Ridge Steed. So what that means is I think this looks weaker than that card. Although that was a great card, it doesn't have to be that good. I still just don't think this looks like it makes the cut compared to a lot of options for Paladin. So not unplayable by any means. I just think there are going to be better options out there. So this is a card I missed in a previous review, just overlooked it somehow. Plague of Flames for Warlock, 1 mana, destroy all your minions. For each one, destroy a random enemy minion. So we did talk about this one a lot on stream, and came to some interesting conclusions. So everybody said, Reform Scheme, the super combo where you summon 7 minions and you wipe your opponent's board. And that is possible. It's a super cheap Twisting Nether, right? It's 4 mana and you just kill everything. The problem with setting up particularly predefined combos like that is that it does utilize 2 cards. Now, we've seen Paladin do that with things like Equality and Wild Pyromancer. It was pretty cool in the past, right? So they could use a 2-card clear. So it's not impossible that that's a play, but particularly with Reform Scheme, it's pretty risky, because if you don't draw it early enough, you don't get enough imps out of your Reform Scheme. If you top deck it, then it's going to feel pretty bad. It doesn't have that reliability. There are other options for Warlock to summon a handful of things, but it may not be a full board wipe as consistently as you'd like. So I think instead the life for Plague of Flames isn't going to be this like removal combo piece necessarily for big late game control plays. I think instead it might just be a cheaper tempo kind of reset of the board for a deck that's running a lot of stuff they don't mind dying, or perhaps even things they'd like to kill with death rattles. So maybe even like a one of in Zoo where you're just like, okay, I'm behind, I got to do a reset here somewhere. Let's just take a couple minions here, a couple tiny 1/1s, and kill a couple 8/8s for my opponent, right? Get rid of those mountain giants, and let's keep rolling. Maybe other decks that are control could still put this card in somehow. If you just got a bunch of lackeys or these other pieces that you don't mind killing, then that would be totally fine. So I do see a path forward for this card. I think it's just such a powerful swing opportunity to kill your weak stuff or death rattle minions or things you want to die in exchange for your opponent's really awesome stuff. That's cool in Hearthstone to see, but I don't know if it's specifically built around super hard. It may just be something you kind of toss in and hope for the best. In other words, they're not limiting their scope too much or running a bunch of cards specifically because of Plague of Flames. It's only going to be there when it kind of fits the game plan of the deck anyway. So that wraps it up for our detailed reviews. Now let's jump into some quick reviews. Mortuary Machine is a 4-star card. Conjured Mirage is a 4-star card. Shadow of Death is a 3-star card. Pharaoh Cat is a 4-star card. Bone Wraith is a 2-star card. Plague of Flames is a 3-star card. Embalming Ritual is a 3-star card. Tomb Warden is a 4-star card. Pharaohs Blessing is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That is it. I felt only partially coherent for this review, so hopefully it made sense and this analysis wasn't too bad. But share your thoughts on it below, good or bad. I want to hear your thoughts on these cards. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Tell me everything. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.